Well, good evening and welcome to our fourth and final program in the summer forum series on race and racial justice. Thank you for joining us tonight. Again, my apologies for the technical problems that we had last week with the collapse of the Zoom channel we were using. I hope you didn't have any trouble connecting with the live stream for tonight. Our guest tonight is Bishop Joseph Perry. The bishop is an auxiliary bishop for the Archdiocese of Chicago. He's also an adjunct professor of canon law at Mundelein Seminary, where seminarians from the Archdiocese of Dubuque study. And he is chair of the U.S. Conference of Bishops Committee on African American Catholics. So Bishop Perry, thank you so much. We're honored and enlightened by your presence tonight. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to start, I recognize that you were raised in Chicago and went to seminary in Milwaukee, ordained for the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and then later appointed auxiliary bishop in Chicago. I wonder if in those years there was a point at which, or a circumstance which made it occur to you that the church does not always practice what it teaches about race and racial justice. Did you have one of those waking moments or not?
I think the most obvious one for me is, of course, once you're ordained a priest, you move around parishes for the most part, except in a place like Chicago, we were so big, some priests get locked into certain areas of the diocese, but Milwaukee was a much smaller city, and the city environs itself only 600,000 people, as opposed to Chicago's 8 million. But it occurred to me that many of our parishes matched pretty much the profile of the city, which were segregated neighborhoods and therefore segregated churches and schools. And I was always puzzled by that. Why couldn't the church break through that more than it was? That's always been the case, especially in a city. I know that's true of Chicago because I was a kid here in Chicago for a while, and we witnessed in the 50s and the 60s the hyper segregated profile of the city, racial profile of the city, and the racial turnover and some of the famous redlining that went on. And what troubled me most was to see how normative that was for most people, even Catholics. We get used to our separatism, and we don't seem to want to break out of that or see any value for doing anything different than what Pentecost asked us to do from the Acts of the Apostles on that famous day the church was born. So that has kind of kept with me over the years, why that is, because it still goes on.
Mm-hmm. There was an article only a couple of months ago about how redlining, the effect it had on the city of Waterloo, where we're at, but also how it has continued to be practiced. It's just a little more subtle these days than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
That's true, so true.
I'm wondering about your family's Catholic background. Do you go back several generations of being Catholic, or?
Yes, Catholicism comes on my father's side. His mother and brother were 2 of 9 children whose family were sharecroppers in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and they moved to Nashville. I'm not sure when they became Catholic, but from my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. Of course, she produced my father, and my father produced me. And then her brother produced a daughter who is a enclosed nun. She's been in a convent since 1947 down in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Dominican cloister. So Catholicism is on Dad's side for several generations. Yes, as far as we can document our family and the former slaves who were part of our ancestry.
So your family was part of the migration north?
Well, from moving from, oh yes, my dad and mother got married right after the war in '46. And at that time, people were going north looking for jobs. There weren't many jobs in the South before the war, and there certainly were none after the war. So many people were coming north. And that's when my folks married in Louisville, Kentucky. Dad was from Nashville, mom from Louisville. And then they came up to Chicago, which was a burgeoning city at that time, and with a lot of migration going on.
By the time you were ordained, was the fact that you were a Black person as a priest or as a bishop fairly well accepted? Or was it still a matter of learning and growing?
I was pretty well accepted. African-American priests were very, very few in number in Milwaukee because we never had in Milwaukee more than 2,000 to 3,000 Black Catholics in the city. And they were ministered to largely by the Capuchin Franciscan fathers and parishes, who is a religious community. You may or may not know them, but they do a lot of work in Central America, Nicaragua, Managua, those areas, Bluefields. And they'd had Black parishes in cities like Detroit and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So within that environment, I was formed and ministered to a largely degree. And I went to one of their seminaries, their high school and college seminaries. So they always had a social outreach, a social justice bent to their charism. So I was fortunate to experience all of that and to learn from it.
Okay. As you well know, the bishops of the United States have issued two major pastoral letters on race and racial justice, one in 1979 and more recently in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you could just kind of compare and contrast those two statements and talk a little bit about what changed in the 39 or 40 years between the two statements. What did the church learn?
You're referring to the 1979
Brothers and Sisters?
Brothers and Sisters to Us, and then Open Wide Our Hearts, the pastoral letter that was issued in 2018. The 1979 document was a more technical and analytical document. It mentioned facts and figures. And the document that came out in 2018 was deliberately couched in the form of a Pauline letter from the New Testament, kind of an exhortation or an invitation to a self-examination and reflection upon a problem that manifested itself in the Christian church, namely racism. Those are the two stylistic differences that I notice between the two documents, and rightly so. And both documents went through several different drafts and we didn't want one necessarily repeating the other. But of the two of them, I guess I like the most recent one in 2018. Actually, since 1958, the bishops have put out about 10 different documents treating the topic of racism, and those documents usually reference something that was going on in society at the time.
Mm-hmm. In terms of content or insight, how do you see that having developed or matured in the last 30 years or so?
I see that largely by the leadership of the bishops. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, as you know, is located in Washington, D.C. It's a racially diverse service organization of bishops. Every bishop in the country has automatic investment in the conference, presence or inauguration in the conference by reason of his consecration. But they also take to themselves some pretty top-level leaders and experts working on the needs in the ministries and the social issues that mean most to the variety that is the Catholic Church in the United States. And they work largely by consensus on topics and issue pastoral letters and other statements and set forth strategies punctuating the moment for the life and the vitality of the church. I think our bishops, by their leadership, have come to tackle this rather neuralgic issue in ways in which they never have before, especially prior to the 1970s. And any number of bishops across the country have piloted sensitivity workshops and education of their diocesan agencies and staffs, and integrating their diocesan administrations, and trying to show people the way in which the church should be leading in this area of life, the church as well as society. Our Catholic colleges and universities, I think, have been conspicuous in addressing these themes by way of guest speakers and alumni. But more work needs to be done in our Catholic educational institutions toward diversifying faculties and administration and student bodies.
Mm-hmm. Let's assume, maybe this is a bad assumption, but let's assume not everyone who is listening tonight has read Open Wide Our Hearts, the pastoral letter from 2018. Could you kind of summarize the main points or the thrust of what the bishops were saying in that letter?
The bishops wanted us to look at some of the stuff we don't look at, and that is how we come up with notions, conscious or subconscious, of difference, race, prejudice, bias, those kinds of things, unbeknownst to ourselves. Nationality, race, ethnicity, language, these uniquely identifying human marks represent the imprint of what I like to think is a remarkably artistic and loving creator upon each of us. But history has demonstrated that human beings have not worked well with these diverse imprints and their contribution to the weave of the human race. And we continue to struggle as individuals and as church to effect a universal recognition of the beauty of each one of us, whether we're white, black, or brown. And we believe the Christian message shows us how. In the Gospels, we find a definite pattern in the life of Jesus, where he broke through the popular biases and prejudices that plagued the society of his day. He seems to show off overt displays of friendship, interest in individual persons who were, for a variety of reasons, on the margins of society, in religion, or cast aside as inferior. Jesus called everyone to conversion of life, as we know, be they fellow Jews, Romans, Samaritans, Gentiles, the wealthy, or other individuals whose lives were morally compromised. And in addition, of course, the scourge of racism was alive and well in Jesus' day, and never more obvious than the plight of the Jews in Palestine. And then what happens to Jesus? Well, he suffers the final fate of marginalized peoples under the tyranny of oppression, crucifixion, reserved for Jews and slaves and criminals and conquered peoples and other undesirables. And biblical scholarship strongly suggests that Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus carry his cross to the hill of execution, was more than likely a black man, coming from the area of Cyrene, where he lived. He helped Jesus carry his cross to the hill of execution, forced into this role, of course, by Pilate's troops, who were ordered to carry out the death sentence that day. Jesus' famous parable of the Good Samaritan and his strong counsel to his disciples to love their enemies and care for the stranger, regardless who they were, are all formidable indications that Jesus showed no partiality and thus set the tone for the discipleship of his followers through a message that all people are called to salvation and to be members of his Father's kingdom. So it's these kinds of teachings that the letter appeals to that have challenged Christians these 2 millennia. Needless to say, church members have not always been representative of the Lord's teachings. But in times such as our own, I think it helps to revisit the Gospels and the Lord's counsel about neighborly regard in order to understand what it is we are called to as Christians to overturn the racial problems of our day. And insofar as we can do this, implement the Lord's teaching, he insisted that we were lights in the world and the salt of the earth. In other words, we are the seasoning of life's experience toward the better. So, the examination of conscience, as Catholics are used to, as we do in Lent or before we go to confession, or in other contexts, the letter really moves us to examine our hearts and to see the church's social teaching not so much from a distance, but from what we are called to as baptized Christians to help create the kingdom here on earth as far as it lies within our power.
There are a number of, I don't know if you want to call them ideas or theories or constructs that have come up in our discussions over the last few weeks related to race and racial justice in this country. I'd just like to get some feedback for you of your understanding of the church's relationship or understanding of these, let's call them concepts. The first one is critical race theory.
Mm-hmm.
One of our speakers brought that up. There was feedback about that it's the theory that basically has been invented that doesn't reflect reality. I wonder what your sense of that is.
Critical race theory. I think history and anthropology describe for us this human penchant we have for stratification and systems of caste, you might say, that see groups of people oppressing other groups of people advantaged and others disadvantaged, not only for reasons of race, but sometimes even within the same racial or ethnic group, reasons of culture or dialect, even while speaking the same language, demarcations for reasons of conquest, reasons of land grabbing, perceiving another group to be an inferior group, the need for a cheap labor force, for reasons of shortage of resources, jobs, and so forth. In the United States, the demarcations have been largely racial and economic opportunity that have divided peoples. But humans are by nature competitive, and that competition can and oftentimes turns unjust or deadly. We see this throughout history. And then there's a deeper notion here too, Dave. A sociologist by the name of Kahil Mohammed from Harvard University came out with a book about a year and a half ago titled The Condemnation of Blackness. It's a rather thick book that I finished reading only a couple of months ago in the midst of COVID lockdown. And this book lays out the thesis that Caucasians have harbored the need to criminalize swaths of Black people in order to sense their own birthright. The color Black emerges in the Caucasian consciousness as not having parity with whiteness. Certainly our conceptions of beauty and innocence and privilege have come to be premised in white skin. That's our society. Caucasian consciousness has deemed Blackness sinister, evil, unworthy, and inferior in order to justify things like slavery and domination, segregation, as the former governor, George Wallace of Alabama, fought so strenuously to maintain in the South of the 1960s. But when we recall outright efforts of real estate in the past to keep neighborhoods white vis-a-vis certain covenants signed by people, or secret undocumented redlinings that go on and explicitly describing who was not eligible to purchase or rent in neighborhoods populated by whites, that served to keep whites away from experiencing the culture and the human experience of Blacks and Latinos and others, suggesting that whites and Blacks and others had nothing to share, nothing to respect in each other. So the vital benchmarks of life and well-being and education and religion, recreation, financial well-being were off limits to certain people. In other words, we have not felt the need for mutual encounter unless required to do so by the law or that which takes place by chance. A chance encounter with someone else of another background or race. You may notice that this notion of diversity is a relatively new term in social parlance. The idea that variety or difference can be a positive experience or a welcome experience or something desirable for purposes of human enlightenment and progress. Well, America still struggles with racial and ethnic diversity. To see anything positive about it, for the longest stretch of our history, African Americans have not been able to accomplish much without the approval or the go-ahead of white society. And that approval we're given has been given begrudgingly. As a result, historically, the African American community suffers from a number of severe hardships. Ours is a story where Black Americans have been kept at arm's length. I might add that a Black American child comes to understand as early as 4 years of age, they figure, that they are different and somehow ugly in comparison to a white child peer. And this has ramifications for an understanding of self-worth, as you can understand, or lack thereof, and overall emotional and psychological health on into adulthood. Such self-hatred, if you can call it that, can register later in antisocial behavior or depression, popular coping chemicals, alcoholism and narcotic usage, and other kinds of self-destructive behavior.
So
I don't think, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The concepts of white privilege or white fragility, I think, is a term that we are seeing now. There's a book by that title. They arise out of these historical circumstances, or this? Do you have any doubt that they are real?
It's a conditioning. It's conditioning. It's a cultural conditioning, a negative cultural conditioning that we haven't overcome certain what I would call misplaced or misinformed assumptions about people. Even an elementary school child will select the white crayon, the yellow or gold crayon, to indicate goodness or happiness, specialness, and purity, and see the black or the brown or the other dark crayons to indicate badness, evil. Early cowboy movies depicted the bad guy dressed in black, you know. The Lone Ranger was always dressed in white. Angels are white, devils are black. Does the classroom teacher reverse these kinds of notions for the children? Is a question, I think. American society has propagated social messaging to the detriment of certain groups, namely Black, Brown, Native, Asian, such that a Caucasian American can reason with impunity that Black and Brown or Native peoples have nothing to offer him, and is in fact a danger to the path of his achievements and well-being, provoking a diminishment of the value of everything he has amassed. The misplaced perceptions, uninformed conceptions, prejudgments, ignorance have left behind some indelible imprints upon our collective social consciousness. And we were raised to think and do this way. In America, we can't seem to shake off the unequal applications of life and well-being when it comes to people not of European background. Precisely when we think that life is making a turn for the better with race relations, some ugly or deadly incident upsets the tone and the mood of the nation. From a Christian perspective, what tends to keep me from seeing a brother or sister in the face of another? We are frightened when the image from close up or from afar is black. Martin Luther King used to say that we must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools. It's a huge nut to crack.
As a Black man, how do you perceive or experience white privilege?
White privilege is the ability to move within and around and above systems and institutions with acceptance, progress, and opportunity without challenge, without discrimination, without any and ways in which Black people or brown people cannot move without being stopped at the door and questioned as to whether they belong. That's privilege.
How or why does this seem to get so often focused on law enforcement from your perspective?
It's focused on,
tends to be right now, I think, in our conversations around the country.
It's focused on law and enforcement so much because the Black man has so often and for so long been criminalized and stopped in his tracks from moving into territory that is simultaneously being occupied by whites. To protect that turf means that there's going to be lines of demarcation, lines drawn in the sand, whereas where a Black man can stand and whereas a white man can stand. And traditionally, we've been raised to know and to think that there are places where we couldn't stand, we couldn't function, we couldn't operate, we couldn't be educated, because there were those who said we could not.
I wanted to ask you about the church's relationship to Black Lives Matter. I know Bishop Braxton addressed this a few years ago. Archbishop Laurie has an interesting article in America this week. What is your perspective on that?
I see Black Lives Matter as a movement, as a voice for Black concerns. Admittedly, it enjoys mixed reviews. Black Lives Matter is a slogan or a motto, or you might even call it a catchphrase, akin to other such appeals that have marked social protest movements in the past, here and globally. On the Black Lives Matter's website, I've looked at it a couple times in the last months. You find also some statements that would be at variance with Catholic teaching and moral doctrine, and would, by the estimation of some, attempt to overthrow society as we know it, suggesting a sort of anarchy. And this is where its critics send off an alarm or register hesitancy with the movement being a voice for the Black community. But Black Lives Matter is not an officially established racial justice organization. Certain critics who want to distance the movement go so far as to call it a Marxist organization, although the people who align with the movement do not see themselves as such. But you find people chant its words, but may not necessarily understand what everyone means behind the rhetoric of some of its adherents, BLM, Black Lives Matter. Now, some of the objections that I hear from time to time about Black lives, I don't think we can expect Black Lives Matter to sanction Catholic social doctrine. For Black Lives Matter is not a religious movement, but chiefly a social, what I would call a social outcry, whose adherents come from a variety of backgrounds across the country and outside the country. Protests against law enforcement's record of harsh treatment of Blacks, systems that register hesitancy, if not exclusion, of people of color. Black Lives Matter, by all accounts, is a loosely organized association among its adherents. Its activities tend to vary depending upon local issues from place to place. And as with all social movements, certain of its cheerleaders tag along other agendas. You can expect that. When it comes to the question of endorsing or not endorsing Black Lives Matter, if the analogy is appropriate, I find it akin to our partisan allegiances, whether Democrat, Republican, Independent. We don't subscribe to every idea that emanates from their platforms, their individual platforms, but in most instances subscribe to their spirit or their service track record. And Black Lives Matter has listed on its website some social and morally questionable ideology. For example, to deconstruct the Western prescribed nuclear family structure, notions of transgenderism, freeing the community from the tight grip of what they title heteronormative thinking. We're not sure what all this means on their website or who has the authority in their ranks to publish such in social media. But from a Catholic perspective, these kinds of philosophies or ideologies would be troublesome. But taking another look at Black Lives Matter, it appears its adherents long to see established throughout American society an affirmation that Black lives do matter, and once this is endorsed by society, it is believed we can articulate that all human lives matter because all lives do matter. But right now, it appears by a succession of current events, some lives do not matter, namely Black ones. The talk back that all lives matter is taken by observation to devalue the strength of meaning behind Black Lives Matter or discount the essential message of the movement. Now, taken at face value, Black Lives Matter can be understood by many people of goodwill as an invocation born out of tears and frustration. Otherwise, see Black Lives Matter for its posture of protest, intending to influence legislation and policy that would dismantle the structures of discrimination and privilege. In absence of a Martin Luther King type of leader today, Black Lives Matter might be seen to fill in the gaps left by a dearth of Black leadership in these times. Social protest movements are famous for their disorganization and varying degrees of chaos and inner conflict goings on. Black Lives Matter might be seen analogous to slogans like Black Power in the 1960s, or Solidarity, Solidarność, the Catholic Union movement of Poland protesting the oppression under communism, or even the Zealot movement in Palestine of Jesus' day, where Jews protested the oppression under Caesar. Biblical scholarship says that at least one of the 12 apostles was sympathetic to the ideology behind zealotry and overthrow of Roman oppression. We run into, as well as the media highlights people in different corners of society who find all of this outcry and unrest something of an irritant. But every socially oppressed group, if you look at history, has chosen monikers for their protest movement that supplied passion, meaning, and direction to their revolution. And these slogans or catchphrases pass on with the passage of time. New ones are adopted by groups as social movements evolve and issues morph into other things.
I heard a conversation not too long ago between two people. One of them was quite disturbed by what he perceived to be the level of anger or passion, if you want, among the protesters that we see in the streets since the death of George Floyd.
Mm-hmm.
And the other person was arguing that from a Christian values standpoint, there is a place for righteous anger.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he cited Jesus in the temple with the
Mm-hmm.
money changers.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think overall or by and large, the protests have stepped beyond a line of justifiable anger, or?
I don't think it has been excessive. There are parts of it, the destructive aspects of it, the destruction of property, and that sort of thing seems to be a natural part of protests that has not been heard. But people are frustrated because they don't believe they are listened to. But I find it interesting that the destruction has been mostly property and property values and not so much human beings. I'm comforted that that is the case this time around. The bloodletting or the loss of life was practically almost unable to be measured. There was no such thing like that going on. So I think people just wanted to make a statement, strong statements, that there are certain things that simply cannot continue as they have been continuing in the name of law enforcement and the issues of poverty and opportunity.
There seems, I think, lately too to have been in the discussion some criticism of trying to judge the past by contemporary values or principles. I think they call it presentism or something.
Mm-hmm.
Basically saying you can't judge the past by the values that we have today. Do you think that explains or excuses the church's defense of slavery and its historic attitude towards people of color? I mean, how could we have missed this in the gospel for so long?
That's a very good question. How come we could have missed it? I mean, there are people who have used passages of scripture to justify by slavery, to justify the notion that blacks were 3/5 human beings, or that their natural condition was for labor, or to be treated haphazardly, or to be not the subject of certain human and civil rights. Yes, that went on for, my God, 400 some years. How could we have missed it? It's an unfortunate betrayal, I think, of the man whom we call the Lord Christ, who gave us another way, another teaching in this regard. But for reasons of greed and gain, those kinds of evils, it went on for so long. But thank God that there were heroic individuals. Many of them were abolitionists. Many of them, even within the church, were heroic in breaking through the laws and lawless customs that existed at the time, the Jim Crow, and made a way from no way for people to get them through. We call it the mysterium iniquitatis in Latin, the mystery of evil. There's no logic to it. You tremble before it and you pray that it be eradicated. We make it the subject of our examinations of conscience before we go to bed at night or before we go to confession, or during the seasons of Lent when we try to grasp more authentically that conversion that the Christian gospel calls us to.
You know, I hope this isn't a a secret or a shock to you, but church documents sometimes tend to be kind of theoretical, divorced from people's lived experience. In your experience, what really changes a person's attitude or behavior about race or racial justice?
Concrete steps, some practical actions. How can Catholics or Christians in general reset the tone established for the world by the Savior Jesus Christ? How can we let the gospel redeem us from the social sins of indifference or prejudice, racial and ethnic profiling, those kinds of things? I don't think any of us can overturn the present ills by ourselves, nor can any of this be done overnight. And the task is also daunting, especially in face of opposition showing up here and there and some ugly stuff that you see portrayed on the internet, coming up on your iPhone by way of news. But I think we can certainly impact our own little corners of the world for the better. And I think the gospel asks us to do that. People ask me all the time what they can do, and I take their question as a token of sincerity. So there are some concrete steps. We might first reflect upon how we were raised vis-a-vis overt expressions or subtle references to the inferiority of certain people. Usually Blacks, Latinos, Natives, Asians. But many of us were brought up with things like Polish jokes and things of that nature, messaging or remarks or profanities brought out in the open by parents or relatives, neighbors, co-workers, friends that spoke of exclusion of people because they were different or somehow deemed to be in the way of our lives. Courageously examining our own consciences regarding our thoughts and words and actions or inactions, we can determine where we may have picked up conscious or unconscious bias regarding peoples of color or other marginalized peoples from our home or formative environments. How has all of this influenced my worldview and determined my assumptions laid against people? I remember certain kinds of articulations that went around the household by neighbors and friends and family about the habits and the attitudes of white people toward us. And I remember the specific instructions my dad always gave us as to how we should appear before a white person when we are addressed, how we should carry ourselves. So we might ask ourselves, do I avoid the experience? Do I avoid the neighborhoods, the worldview of people of color? Do I see people of color a threat to me in any way? Do I consider people different from me to be beneath me or in my way of opportunity? Do I figuratively cross the street when a person of color is found walking towards me? Do I find myself enmeshed in a posture of I could care less how people are treated as long as I can do what I want to do and gain what I want to gain? We're believers. And so our gestures and words should indicate that every man, woman, and child has inherent dignity. Therefore, Christians that we are, it's everywhere necessary that we are in communion with one another. Another concrete action I suggest to people, especially those working in our parishes and dioceses, is to arrange a safe space for your children in your home or elsewhere, or if you work with young people, to have them reflect and pray about racism and these recent events. Listen to the current experience of young people. What do they see happening in their schools with fellow students of different background, race, or ethnicity? How can they, as young people, be ambassadors of friendship and goodwill? encourage and allow their creative expression, because as we all know, young people have keen observations about right and wrong. So we can invite them to come up with action steps that are meaningful to them.
This might be a little unfair, but if you were a Catholic parent of a, let's say, grade school child in third, fourth, fifth grade, how would you introduce this to them, and what would you tell them about what's going on in the world around them related to race and justice?
If I was a parent, I would want to make sure that somehow diversity is scheduled in their lives. I would not want to see my own children's circle of friends and schoolmates to be totally of one race. I think they would stand to be impoverished by that socially. Maybe it's idealistic for me to say that because I'm not a parent, kind of thing, but I think it's the kernel of what we're talking about in terms of the next generation being able to do better what we've been trying to do in this current generation, or what we have failed to do. I would want to structure diversity and make sure that diversity was structured in my own life. Who are the people that you hang around with? Are they mostly or entirely white? Who makes up the friends of your children? Are they mostly or entirely white? How can human variety be found amidst your friends and co-workers and neighbors? It's not already legislated by the law. How can we dismantle our unconscious preferences for an exclusive white environment where we live and work and recreate and worship? To me, that's the business of Christians today, and business of Catholics in our parishes today, as far as I'm concerned. And we have not done enough of this. I encourage Catholics all the time to worship occasionally in a Catholic church of a different ethnic group, to imbibe a sense of the worth and the offerings of a people, the culture and the beauty of a people. Select one of the many food pantry ministries operated by our parishes and show up to help out, bringing your children along so they can see what Christian action is all about. To witness and be a part of vital ministry to the poor and the hungry. I'm absolutely delighted when parents do this. They come and help out to serve food and supply dignity to people, and they bring their kids along to help out with that. That's very educational for them.
I think in the current conversations around race, you hear the opinion that things look a little better in terms of how people in the United States are responding to polls, the racial diversity of the groups that we saw on the streets protesting, that young people in general tend to be a little less racist than the generation before them. Do you have the sense that that's true or not?
I have the sense that that is true. Moving around as I do as a bishop into all of our churches, there's a lot of people around of genuine goodwill. They may not always know what, for example, action steps they can take unless they are led by the efforts of their pastors or other people who are versed in all of this. But yes, it takes an ugly incident or something awful to somehow throw us in a tizzy and to feel like we're starting all over again. Because there are certain people in certain corners of our society who have vested interests in making sure that none of this happens. That somehow we have to go back to Jim Crow. We have to go back to the Civil War. We have to go back to slavery or whatever. Back, I think as far back, at least until the 1980s, you might remember there were any number of articles in magazines and journals and op-ed columns and newspapers that were hinting at or suggesting the browning of America and what that portends for social relations and progress in American society. And I remember those hints. I don't know if you've ever read much of that, but it started at least by the 1980s, to my memory.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, the browning of America? Well, that means some people are going to be upset. Some people are going to be act like George Wallace, I guess, of the 1960s. Yeah, you know.
Do you think the church can and is playing a part in helping white people deal with their fear of the browning of America?
I think we can do more. Racism, race relations, and everything about that is one of the most difficult topics to deliver in the pulpit. I bid people to encourage their pastors to preach against racism. I think it's a way it can be done that can be appreciated by the Christian heart without blaming people or pointing fingers at people. I think pastors can do more to take personal responsibility to eradicate traces of it when they find it in the parish, especially when people, by way of their conscious or unconscious actions, are creating or preferring a white environment. I encourage parishes, study groups, Bible groups to read books and articles on the topic of race and its treatment in America and the challenges faced by people of color, particularly those most marginalized. And then select one of the pastoral letters on racism. I think it's marvelous to find how they have developed from, say, 1958 on up to 2018. And see what we're talking about when we're talking about structural realities that exist in our society and institutions that impact an individual's ability to access resources that include well-funded schools districts, having quality and affordable health care, fair-paying jobs, having banking and grocery stores and small businesses in their neighborhoods, and experiencing fairness and access to housing. A lot of people are not faced with this from day to day, so they tend to think everything is going reasonably well. That civil rights in 1964 solved it all. The law does not have to move a person's heart. Something else must happen, and that is a conversion that this pastoral letter in 2018 calls us to, a personal examen. Otherwise, the laws won't make a difference. The lawless customs will continue, and people's cries to keep the status quo as is, will prevail.
And we in the church should be experts at conversion.
We should be.
Indeed.
We should be.
Just a last question. From your perspective there at Mundelein, do you see that you're sending back to us men for ordination who are better prepared to help us address this issue and to open wide our hearts, as the document said?
I'm deeply impressed by these students, the quality of the men whom we are training for the priesthood these days. They're different than we were when we came up. I look back at my years and I suddenly realized how much I didn't know about life, even though life was going on around me. Of course, the power of social media today and All of that has created a different platform for education and social outreach today than ever existed for us when we were in the seminary in the 60s and 70s. I'm impressed by the deep sincerity and the religious weaning of these men who want to serve the church. They know this is no Disneyland that they're going to be launched into once they are ordained, and they're going to have to give it their wholehearted dedication and fidelity and energy to somehow create a situation that Jesus would be pleased when he comes and takes us with him. It's a different terrain today, but I don't know. It makes you want to have started in seminary all over again, because what these guys are getting today is an improvement over past curriculums, that's for sure.
Okay. Well, we could probably talk for a long time, but we have work to do.
Yes, we do.
Talking is done.
Yes,
I want to thank you, Bishop Perry, so much.
You're welcome.
You accomplished exactly what I hoped you would do as we brought this four-part summer forum series to a conclusion, which is not so much a conclusion, but a jumping off point from where we go from here. And I'm so grateful, you know, when I emailed you, you responded almost immediately and without any conditions said yes. That doesn't always happen, particularly with bishops. I'm just immensely grateful. And I think that people who were listening tonight and will see the recording of it later will be very grateful as well for your words and your insight and your wisdom. And so I thank you for that. I thank you for the work you do on behalf of the church, opening the heart of the church itself to our brothers and sisters. And so thank you very much. For those of you who are listening, just a reminder that at the bottom of this web page where you are watching, if you're watching tonight on the Waterloo Catholic's website, the bottom of the page there is a link to the evaluation form. There's also the email address if you have questions that you would like me to pass on to Bishop Perry, and the place where we would post his answers in the case that there are some questions. So to all of you, thank you for participating in the summer forum. I know it wasn't quite as engaging or interactive as if we could have been in person. But then if we could have been in person, we wouldn't have had people like Bishop Perry a part of it either. So that in itself is a grace worth all of the nervousness about technology. So for all of you, thank you and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop.